Okay, well, why don't we get started? So I'm Glenn Cohen, and it's my privilege to welcome you to this event. I'm going to begin with a couple of announcements, then I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we're going to get right into it. So welcome if you haven't been to one of our Zoom events before. This is how it will work. There will be remarks from the speakers, a moderated discussion, and then we will take questions in one of two ways. First, and the way we prefer, is via the Zoom Q&A function. Your questions will be seen by the moderator and the panelists, although will not show for attendees. You're also welcome to use Twitter to send us questions using the hashtag #raceandhealth. That's hashtag race and health. We'll be monitoring the hashtag to pull questions, but the Q&A format on Zoom is preferred. Please do not use the raise hand feature as nobody will be monitoring it. I also wanted to mention this is one of a series of events we're doing for the semester. We'll be doing some on organ donation, access to COVID-19 vaccinations and treatments in the US globally, the legalization of hallucinogenic, and further conversations in race and health. You can find out about these events by going to our website and signing up for our newsletter. It only comes out twice a month, and it's really the best way to hear about upcoming events. And the last thing I'll say is that this event is also accompanied by a blog symposium on our blog, Bill of Health. So if you find what's said here interesting, or in general are interested in health law and bioethics, we recommend you take a look at the blog. Okay, now to introduce the panelists. I'm just going to say the barest minimum about them. You can read more about them on the website. They're incredibly impressive people, so I could take the entire hour just by introducing them, so consider this an appetizer. First, my co-moderator for this event is going to be Craig Knopf, who's an associate professor of law and director of the Health Law Certificate Program at the University of Colorado Law School. We're also joined by Michelle Goodwin, who's the Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, and the founding director for the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. We'll be joined by Dana Matthew, who is the Dean and Harold H. Green Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School. Kimani Paul-Emile, who is Professor of Law and the Associate Director and Head of Domestic Programs and Initiatives at Fordham Law School Center on Race, Law, and Justice, and Faculty Co-Director of the Fordham Law School Stein Center for Law and Ethics. And Samuel Roberts, who is an Associate Professor of History and of Socio-Medical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. This is a blockbuster group. I am so grateful they gave us the time today. And now I'm going to pass it on to Craig, who's going to moderate the first half of the event, and then I'll come back in and moderate the audience Q&A. Craig, please take it away. I think you're on mute. One sec.
Yeah, thank you so much, Glenn. And I really just want to begin by saying thanks to Glenn, Carmel, and Chloe, as well as Laura, who I believe just joined the team at Petrie-Flom for putting on this event. Without this initiative, their initiative, this event would not have happened. And I'm so excited that Petrie-Flom is doing this, and I'm so honored to be a part of it. And also to be moderating this panel, which every law professor on this panel has been a mentor of mine at some point. So I'm so excited to be doing this. I know it's such a busy time, and really appreciate your being here. So most of the questions haven't been discussed ahead of time, and so I'm looking forward to the back and forth and the discussion that they will hopefully generate. But really, you know, I want to begin by asking a question that's somewhat personal, I suppose, because, you know, writing about race and health is as much a calling and a form of activism, I feel, as just, you know, doing a job. And so, you know, in the narrative spirit of critical race theory, in some ways, I want to ask you about your story and about how you found yourself beginning to work in this space. You know, what animates you historically, or even today, to engage in this particular struggle in this particular way at this particular time. So I'm going to start by asking Michelle, and we'll just sort of continue through our panelists in order.
Well, it's great to be with you, Craig. It's wonderful to be with you, Glenn, and thank you, Petrie-Flom Center, for hosting this. As I think about this work, I consider myself a bit of a witness, and I think in my life I've been witnessing and I've been writing since I can ever remember, reading it too, and then trying to put onto paper things that I observed or thought about. And as you were asking that question, something flashed to mind, an experience that I had as a little girl, which I actually haven't ever really, I think, in a public forum spoken about. And it was a weekend that I was with some older relatives, which I spent a lot of time with older relatives. And on a particular evening, I think I was probably about 4, I saw a Black man killed. And it was interesting because these were women who were from the South. This was not unusual to them, except we weren't in the South. We were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I think there was a lesson, it was like a very full lesson altogether, the things that were said and the things that weren't said, because this was like normalcy and this is what a child sees. I mean, it was strange. It was a man, police. I saw a police car. I saw police pull out very big things out of their car. I saw them chase this man. I saw a very limp, bloody body then put into a police car. I was only 4 years old when I saw that. I didn't have the words to describe what I saw then. It's a memory that's indelible that I will never forget. I'll never forget the reactions of the women who were there, and I'll never forget the fact that this man was unarmed, and he was maybe a kind of what people at an earlier time might have called a kind of town drunkard, kind of like a harmless person walking down the street, with a bottle of alcohol. Anyway, there's so many different, memories that are curated over time that I think that just sort of leave these little imprints over time, and then that just call us to then speak to what it is that we see and that we know. And that's just a memory that comes up. I'm sure I could, bake this in very different ways, looking at statistical issues that affect people's health and things like that. There are so many disparities across so many lanes that we all should be concerned about. Everybody should be concerned about, but there are human experiences. And there are a number of them that I've read about or ones that I've seen that call me to want to speak about them.
Absolutely, and I think it is, that humanity that really needs to be part of our conversations more today. Dana, might you jump in and speak a little to you?
Yes, I too want to say thank you for the question and for the opportunity to speak with this great group, both to you, Craig, and to you, Glenn, and to Petrie-Flom. I was orphaned. My brother was orphaned. We were together orphaned before we reached the age of 21. And my father died before the age of 50, and I now can see that my scholarship is reflective very much of the fact that I think he died of inequality. My mother died before the age of 62, and I think clearly she died of poor healthcare in particular. I look at that part of my family. I grew up relatively poor in the South Bronx, and so most of my family in the segregated North was also in very low income settings. They're all dead. And that means my children and my grandchildren don't have the generational wealth, either in economic terms or in human terms, of my family, and that is inequitable. The nexus between those health disparities that I've experienced firsthand and my understanding of equal protection and the unfulfilled dream thereof has brought me to the study of public health, inequity, and law.
That's incredibly powerful, Dana. I mean, it's just so interesting because, you, Michelle, everyone else, you've been mentors, and I've known you for years, and I did not know these stories. Kimani, I was wondering if you could speak next.
Sure. So I want to join in thanking Craig and Glenn for inviting me here today to talk about this really important issue with friends and colleagues. So that's always fun. And thanks for this opening question. So after law school, I received an Equal Justice Works Fellowship to work in the Racial Justice Unit at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where I worked on a case in which pregnant, substance-addicted women were arrested and prosecuted under child endangerment laws when they sought prenatal care and obstetrical services at the Medical University of South Carolina. So the hospital's policy applied only to those women addicted to cocaine, even though the use of alcohol and tobacco during pregnancy poses a far greater threat to the health of the developing fetus. And the policy also singled out low-income Black women, a population that we know is long and woefully underserved by the healthcare community. So this case, which is Ferguson versus South Carolina, was ultimately argued successfully before the US Supreme Court, but the court based its decision on very narrow Fourth Amendment search and seizure grounds, and all but ignored the important and troubling sex and race discrimination concerns raised by the case. So it was this common inability of the law to adequately address these bioethics and intersectional racial equality concerns that inspired my decision to both pursue a doctoral degree, but it also prompted me to direct my research towards examining matters that occur at the nexus of bioethics, race, structural inequality, and the law. So that's my trajectory.
No, that's fascinating. And I remember reading that case in law school and it sort of generating great interest in me as well. Samuel, I was wondering if you might jump in.
Yeah, I too want to thank you, Craig, and you, Glenn, for putting this together. I've been looking forward to this for a while. And to that first question, conversations like this one actually become part of your intellectual, at least my intellectual biography. I think if my name began with the letter A and we had not been doing this alphabetical order, my answer actually might have been different then than what it is now, just having heard these three, like you said, really enlightening and I guess thought-provoking stories. My intellectual origin story, I guess in terms, if we're doing a timeline, might be earlier than everyone's because I'm the historian. So it goes back to the 1890s, not because I was alive then, but because as a student of late 19th and 20th century history, I was struck how in the primary sources, which is to say the historical record that is left by Black Americans, how many times issues of health come up, like just even in newspaper advertisements where people's, folk remedies or patent medicines or in the advice column, I think my husband's family might have tuberculosis. Will our children therefore get it genetically? All of this shows up, and it did not show up in the secondary literature, which is to say how historians were thinking about politics. And I think it's because as historians, we were all writing after the antimicrobial revolution of the 1940s and afterwards. We have had a kind of historical amnesia about what the body actually meant as a political register. It's not something that you just inhabit. Disease is not something that you suffer. It actually impacts your political subjectivity. That Kenneth Clark had the Dahl test as part of his expert testimony was after we had vanquished a lot of the infectious diseases. If Brown had showed up in 1925, we might have used tuberculosis or any number of diseases to show social inequality. So health is a political register. It doesn't just affect us on an individual level, and certainly not just on a social level, but also affects our politics. So I started off as a political historian who ended up with just what I thought was a simple question: why doesn't this show up in the secondary literature? And then some 20 years later, I'm still trying to answer that question. So thank you for the opportunity to continue this intellectual biography of mine. The next time somebody asks me that question, I'm sure it'll be different after having had what is going to be a wonderful discussion. So thank you to all of you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, one of the lessons of critical race theory and of studying anti-discrimination law is really this integration of personal narrative and intellectual development. And I think that lesson has just been brought home resoundingly in what we've heard in the last few minutes. But Samuel, that's actually a great sort of segue to a different question that I had to get us into some of the further substance of this conversation, which is that, much of the activism and conversation today, part of it is on health and race, so obviously the COVID situation, but a lot of it has to do with, police violence, with, historical inequity in prisons and, issues such as that don't always register for many people as health issues. And so I was wondering from the historical perspective, how should we situate the struggle for health equity? How do you sort of, fit that into this broader narrative of racial inequality that America faces? I know it's an incredibly broad question, but I was hoping that you might be able to say a few words on that.
Incredibly broad question that I guess I have to be the first one to answer it as well. Is that?
And I'd love to follow up.
This is what happens. This is what happens here. You come to a lawyer's panel, and this is what we do.
All of a sudden, I'm being cross-examined here. Yeah, I mean, this year, I don't think I'm the first one, and certainly not the only one to say I'm still trying to wrap my mind around 2020. I think there have been some instructive lessons. I think on one hand, COVID-19 has certainly shown, it certainly has given another dimension to the literal phrase Black Lives Matter. Like, what is Black life itself? What are our life chances? And how are those constrained? And in, the obvious cases ultimately ended by police violence. But I think we have to, I think the movement itself, it's obviously a very much a kind of non-stratified and kind of dispersed movement. But I think generically speaking, or generally speaking, the movement itself recognizes and understands and asserts that to say a Black life matters isn't just that it has the right not to be ended violently and unceremoniously by vigilante, police or private citizens, but also that we must take into account, health inequities that end our lives because of structural violence. Certainly that has been shown in this. I think just the way in which we were caught unawares by the morbidity and mortality in inequality, disparity between Black Americans, Latinx, our Latinx American population, and then everybody, and white Americans, that we were caught unawares by that shows that we haven't been thinking very well about it. Because even those initial predisposing conditions that are identified, hypertension, diabetes, asthma, and cardiac, all of those are found in abundance in terms of the social determinants of health and inequities in Black communities. I would have hoped that an epidemiologist would have said in March, not April, by the way, we should keep an eye out on this. If these are for, clearly our Black population should be warned, but we were not. It was April. And then it was this kind of shock and awe and surprise that happened. So it kind of showed that we haven't been thinking very well in our popular parlance or popular discourse about this. It's a longer history. In a lot of ways, I think COVID-19, like the politics out of Washington, it's a stress test to the system. And we're clearly not passing it very well. That's the historian's way of dodging the question, basically, by pitching it as another question or answering it as another question. But there it is.
So I'd like to build off of that and say that what COVID-19 has done is to expose pre-existing conditions, pre-existing institutional and infrastructural concerns and problems in our society, the sort of pre-existing dominance of racism in our society, which is hard for people to get their minds around, although I think that we live in a vibrant time wherein people can see it. And I'd like to take this question back to the very vestiges of our early landings in the United States. Clearly, when you think about it, an enslaved condition and the trauma, both physical and also emotional and psychological, that is placed upon a people who are literally held in chains and shackled. I mean, you sort of imagine from the multiple points of view, the people who would think that it's fine, not just for a day, not just for a week, not just a year, to people. I mean, psychologically, what does that do to bid on a child? I mean, for this to go on for centuries, that it's okay, and what justifications must the people make to say this is okay, and in fact will pass acts and act acts to support this, fugitive slave acts, such as if the child runs away from a condition that clearly is inhumane and is baked in its own strangeness. And that child runs away, not only is there a psychological condition, we're going to call that drapetomania, such as conditioning the child or the mother or the father that you are crazy to run away from slavery, so we will make of you a scapegoat, and we will stereotype you and stigmatize you for demanding that your humanity be acknowledged. So it's strange from the point of view of people who would do that bidding over and over again. And let's be clear, there were always abolitionists in the country. So for people who say, well, it was the only thing that people knew, no, that is not true. That's part of our failure to engage in appropriate history in our country. There were always abolitionists in the United States, people who were always saying this is inhumane, this is a system that should not persist, it needs to end now. There were Europeans that were sending that message. There were Europeans that were saying we will not buy the cotton and the sugar from the United States because it is inhumane. There were businesses in Europe. In fact, a lot of people don't know that that there were companies that made containers for teacups and also sugar canisters that would emblazon on their canisters that they oppose slavery. Right? Like buy ours to put your sugar in and not these others because we oppose slavery. But then you think about the people who are kept in that system of bondage, right? And that's a lot of unpaid labor. Your kids out in the cotton fields, inadequate clothing, right? Sugarcane, rice, like all of those kinds of conditions. No OSHA health standards. And I think it's important to mark law's complicity in this, because what's interesting is that during the time in which abolitionists can say this is wrong, that you are doing this to human beings, and that's a vibrant picture of who these human beings are as children, men, women, etc. And it's very interesting, law's role in the 13th Amendment, because there is a punishment clause in the 13th Amendment. So we abolish slavery, except if you've been convicted of a crime. So now people who before were human beings that should not be caught in this system now suddenly become convicts. And who wants to come to the aid of a convict? But if you read the historical records, in the South, plantations expanded and grew larger after the 13th Amendment was ratified. The South got, there was a year of time that it took to ratify the 13th Amendment. And before it was ratified throughout the South, they created hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of laws that would lead to children being able to be taken away from their parents, numerous ways of making a convict of a person so long as they couldn't pay their fines and their fees. And, tell me who in 1866 has $100 to pay a fine for walking down a street or standing on a corner. And so it's really important to understand those historical origins before we pivot to anything else. And I'll add one last thing before yielding the floor, and that's the following. If you think about things like coal mines collapsing, we know coal mines, black lung disease, all of that. We get that in the present. But it's important to understand that in the wake of the 13th Amendment, who was the labor that was sent down there? The convicts, the young Black kids who were 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. And when you read the records from Alabama and other places, coal mine collapses, 50 die. Coal mine collapses, 100 die. Coal mine collapses, 150 die. These were young Black kids who couldn't pay fines, who were picked up for arbitrary kinds of things that white kids were not picked up for. And that became a second kind of labor source. And they paid a physical health price. They paid a psychological health price. In reality, we've all been paying the price of that by our failure to come to grips with it and to look at these systems in an honest way. It's no wonder that disparities in healthcare. It's no wonder that there is the lingering effects of tension, high blood pressure, and so much more in Black communities, given that history.
Craig, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to pick up on two threads that my colleagues and co-panelists have articulated so beautifully. Number one, law is not only complicit, but it is the operative mechanism for structural racism. Why is it structural? Because law has structured it. Where has it structured it? And this goes to the breadth of your question. Law has structured and infused racism, which is a hierarchical treatment, devaluing human beings, giving them less access to opportunity, power, and resources. Law has structured it in every single aspect of the social determinants of health, right, from time immemorial. Secondly, I just want to point out that when law does that, it institutionalizes dehumanization. This is crucial because, as I said, it does so in every one of the social determinants of health. Exhibit 1, in 1698, the state of Virginia, not uniquely, enacted a law which said essentially, I'm paraphrasing, it said essentially, if a white person has to kill a black person in order to keep them in line because they are obstinate, and that word is in the statute, and difficult to manage, that shall not be a felony or a crime because they are so insolent a people. Right? The only thing that I've paraphrased incorrectly is by adding the word people, because the origins of such a law, the origins of such a mentality is to dehumanize, to subjugate as something less than equivalent to myself, systemically. This started in 1698, right? Before we even got to the Constitution. Okay? And it started in the relationship between Black bodies and the state. And this permeated housing, education, food distribution. This is why, fast forward to today, this dehumanization continues to allow a people to drink from water bottles because humans need water, not that group, somehow essentially different in nature and kind and in quality than the rest of us humans who deserve water and education and shelter and the things that are required for humanity. We have structured by law dehumanization, and that's my second point.
No, and I have to say it's interesting because I'm sort of wondering whether my notes are on the screen because you're anticipating the questions that I wanted to ask, and the people whom I wanted to ask those questions to are the people anticipating exactly the questions that were going to be directed to them. And so Dana, I just want to ask a follow-up, which was going to be, and so then what, you spoke about the legal levers that absorbed medical lessons in some ways off their time, and in order to dehumanize. What do you see as some of the legal levers, legal solutions that can be deployed today to address the harms you described?
It's my view that at all levels of legal intervention, we have to reverse dehumanization, right? Mm. That's a huge task. And so it'll have to proceed. It's sort of like building a plane while we're flying it, right? Because we've established this so comprehensively. Right now, I strongly believe that the civil rights laws of this country and enforcement thereof are under attack. They're being dismantled, and they are essential to be reinforced and reinvigorated. Private causes of action. We're not going to litigate our way out of it, but we are going to create social norms. Restoration of political participation powers that have been removed from the Voting Rights Act. A reinforcement of the Federal Fair Housing Act, and a restructuring fundamentally of the way that we pay for public education are the places we must start in order to get at these fundamental causes of political and social determinants of public health inequality. But I think I interrupted my colleague Kimani, so I want to.
And actually, so yeah, Kimani, please go ahead. Yes.
Sort of the awkwardness of Zoom. I don't mean to cut anybody off because I'm glad you had the opportunity to follow up with Dana. So just to follow up on the really great history that's been offered by Michelle and Sam and Dana, I might say a couple words just to bring it into the present. But first, just for people perhaps in the audience who may not be fully aware or familiar with structural racism, it refers to the disadvantage that results from the operation of several interconnected social and economic systems, such as education, employment, credit financing, housing, policing, incarceration. Policing is what, Michelle wrote her piece on, the media and healthcare. And it's how all these systems, although they can have independent effects, they're often interrelated such that the inequality that one system creates can be compounded and reinforced and disadvantaged by the others. And what's most notable about structural inequality is that it can manifest in the absence of intentional racism. And so, again, to bring all the great history that Michelle and Samuel and Dana mentioned, I'll just say maybe a word about how it manifests. We see it today through COVID. You know, when COVID first bursted on the scene, many people assumed that the disparate impact we were seeing was because of something sort of biological in brown and black bodies, something sort of unique to brown and black people that made them, you know, uniquely susceptible to the virus. But as we've since come to learn, it's sort of longstanding and at one time state-sanctioned discriminatory practices that increase their exposure and susceptibility to the virus. So the US history of underfunding schools in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, for example, along with widespread educational employment discrimination, has led to Black and brown people being overrepresented in low-wage jobs that are deemed COVID essential, you know, such as food workers, janitors, you know, warehouse workers, postal workers, home health aides, cashiers, meat packers. And the US legacy of redlining and residential discrimination has contributed to Black and brown people being more likely to live in smaller homes in under-resourced and densely populated areas, which of course has increased their risk of transmitting the disease, because as we know now, it's primarily airborne and transmitting the disease to their families and their communities. The diseases they often pick up at work since they've been deemed essential. And these communities are also overexposed to environmental toxins, which can exacerbate the effects of COVID-19. And we can link this back to early 20th century zoning regulations that explicitly segregated Black and brown populations through mechanisms such as the construction of low-income housing in industrial areas near environmental hazards. And Black and brown neighborhoods today still disproportionately lack green spaces and nutritious food options and recreational facilities and healthcare services, like you know, pharmacies just able to fill their prescriptions that they need to deal with their COVID. So again, all of this is sort of the culmination of a lot of sort of this historical structural inequalities and intentional inequality that Samuel and Michelle and Dana mentioned.
And Craig, I'd like to add a sociological dimension to that, right? So we have the history, we have the law, we have the structural, but it's important to understand then the social cultural phenomena. And I think now we're beginning to understand a little bit better the role of, let's say, a Woodrow Wilson and the screening of a film such as Birth of a Nation in the White House, something that would seem so anonymous, and why would NAACP and other organizations say, well, no, you really shouldn't do that. So what is the power of propaganda? And this helps to tie into something with the AMA that I'd like to talk about. So the power of propaganda is the following, that we come out of the past century with certain kinds of stereotypes. Black women as lazy, Black women as welfare queens, Black men as being rapists, that really, we should really fear Black men for their violence, and we should fear them for their predatory sexual nature. All of these stereotypes that just made for common analysis in the United States. But here's the power of propaganda. If you read historical records, and Samuel can help us out here, and I have loads of books that relate to these issues here, you have no historical record in the United States from the 1500, wherever you debate the beginning of slavery, from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, or 1800s, there is no record of Black men just rampaging plantations culture. Now, clearly there were more Black people in these plantations than there were white people, and in these households. There's no historical record. There's no historical record of Black women just being so lazy that now white people have to pick the cotton. Oh my gosh, we got all these Black people from Africa, but they're so lazy. They're just like, they won't do the sugarcane. They won't do the cotton. They won't do the tobacco. My gosh, right? No record of that. No record of that from people who could write their own records. But then the record gets rewritten after the 13th Amendment and during Jim Crow. A new way that we have to think about these Black people, right? Like a new kind of propaganda. And that propaganda is powerful then when we think about the American Medical Association barring membership of Black people, denying and actively working to shut down Black medical schools, and ironically using the argument, well, Black medical schools admit women, including white women, so we should not support them or their membership. These kinds of stereotypes are powerful because then there is a record of Black people not being able to get health assistance at hospitals, being turned away. A history in the last century of Black people dying on the steps of hospitals. After Sammy Davis Jr., right? Famous actor, singer, musician. After his car accident where he loses an eye, They have to drive around for 40 or 50 minutes because hospitals won't take him in Southern California. It's an important lesson for us.
And Michelle, you've actually just segued into the last question I had, which was before I handed it off to Glenn, which exactly was, so we've been talking about the history, we've been talking about slavery, we've been talking about the law, about social determinants, and so I guess the question that I have, which you've introduced, and I'll sort of pass it sort of down the line to Dana, Kimani, and Samuel as well, is so what does medicine have to do with it? Do we sort of throw up our hands and say medical institutions are places where there's little room to move? That racism is so deeply embedded. Some of you know that I sort of press for expanding, thinking about how medicine can be used as a tool for activism, as a sort of rights creating place, and where we give power to patients and others instead of just keeping it in the hands of doctors. But the question is, how can we adjust these medical institutions to think specifically about racism? So Dana, I was wondering if you might have a chance to.
Can I just ask for a clarification on that though, Craig? Medicine or public health?
So specifically medicine, because the thing is, I feel like public health includes, I think has historically included a conversation about the law, about, that Dana talked about, structural narratives that, Kimani spoke more to, historical situations that you and Michelle spoke about. But I'm sort of thinking now specifically the medical institutions. So Michelle talked about the AMA, but, some medical ethics, how do we change that around? And then I will pass it off to Glenn immediately after that. So
I just wanted to get the clarification, and we can talk about why I wanted to make that distinction, but I think you kind of outlined it too. So I'm sorry to interject there. Thank you.
No, please do. I mean, it's for interjection. So Dana, should we start with you? Then we can.
So I'm going to take Samuel's question as a friendly amendment to my answer. This is this process of learning from this incredible panel of discussants. Medicine has everything to do with the problems that we are outlining of discrimination, inequality, and poor health. And it must take account for its influence not only in the healthcare realm, but also in the public health realm. If they are not one and the same, then I would suggest provocatively that the medical mission is bankrupt. And I say that because without if the objective is to bring people to their highest possible level of health, to recognize that, or to fail to recognize that cannot be done apart from the population perspective, the preventive perspective, and the social determinants perspective, that is mandated by the public health lens, then healthcare is in the business of keeping itself in the business of delivering feudal care. That's my view. It is, I think, supported by history. When you look at the fact that we would not have had a Civil Rights Act of 1965 had it not been for 3 dentists, 2 physicians suing on behalf of their patients in order to get them access to a hospital in North Carolina. When the health of a population becomes the priority of health care, then all of the social structures which touch and affect that health will be changed. Before and without that, it will not be. And that's why I feel so strongly that health care has everything to do with the issues of health disparities at a population level that we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Dana. So Kimani, I'd like to ask you to weigh in as well. Do you believe that its intervention, in that way might address some of the situations? Would you like to place the emphasis outside the system? Where would you place it?
No, I thought it was interesting that you said, with the clarification that we're talking about healthcare and not public health. And you mentioned in your question, it's giving power to patients. Perhaps you should give more power to patients. And of course, I want to sort of flip this a little bit, because of course, giving more power to patients can, in certain circumstances, can increase discrimination and inequality. And so what I'm talking about is a particular scenario where, you know, a certain type of discrimination occurs when patients discriminate against their assigned healthcare provider based on the worker's race or ethnicity. And so you think of the scenario where the patient says, you know, I don't want that Black nurse, you know, give me a real nurse, give me a white nurse. And this is a fairly common, but until recently little discussed phenomena, but it disproportionately impacts Brown and Black providers, and particularly, you know, those on the front lines who are nurses and nurses' aides, and who tend to be disproportionately Black and female. We're increasingly seeing these cases arise, and not just with Black and, you know, Latinx providers. We're also seeing it increasingly, and it's been reported widely that people are rejecting their healthcare providers that present as East Asian. You know, I don't want the Chinese doctor. And these biases and fears that we're seeing in this age of COVID have been stoked by our president, who's called the virus, you know, the Kung flu, the China plague. And, you know, these have been interpreted by some as giving them license to act on their biases. And what makes this type of discrimination particularly difficult is that often healthcare institutions are at a total loss for how to respond. And this is because although there are many laws that are implicated when patients discriminate against their assigned healthcare providers, these laws are often in conflict. So just as a quick example, you know, patients have a right to informed consent, which means they have a right to refuse treatment to refuse wanted treatment from an unwanted provider. And this right to refuse is a well-respected legal ethical principle that's, you know, some would say it's based in informed consent, but also could, in some states, based in battery, but it protects against unwanted touching. But patients also have a right to receive stabilizing treatment when they go to the hospital. And this is mandated by a federal law called EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, which requires hospitals to screen and stabilize all patients who arrive in an emergency department with an emergency medical condition. Okay, so that's the patient. But then healthcare workers have rights that have to be respected. And this includes the right to a workplace free from certain types of discrimination, including discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. And this is in keeping with Title VII, which is the employment provision of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And other laws that are implicated as civil rights laws that are implicated as well. But Title VII says, you know, if a healthcare institution continually removes a worker in response to a patient's discriminatory demands, then a healthcare institution could be found to have created a hostile work environment. So they'd be liable there. So this can create problems. I'm going to wrap up really quickly. This creates problems for healthcare institutions because when a patient announces that, you know, they don't want to be treated by the Asian or Black nurse, for example, then the healthcare institution could be damned if it does and damned if it doesn't with respect to its response. So if it accommodates the patient's wishes for a different nurse than the one assigned based on race or ethnicity, then it may be discriminating against the assigned nurse and opening themselves up to legal liability. But if they don't accommodate the patient's demands, then they may violate the law against battery by forcing the patient to be treated by an unwanted doctor or nurse without consent. But then if they don't screen and stabilize the patient, then they could be liable for violating EMTALA. You know, so what do you do? But so this is a type of discrimination that's, again, not often reported, but has happened a lot to Black and Brown and increasingly Asian providers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was wondering if you pick up on that specific point because your excellent contribution, of course, it touches on that and centers on that, and that's really thought-provoking. Samuel, I was wondering if we could sort of close at least my line of questioning with you, because I really would like your thoughts, especially given the clarification you made earlier, because you know it was a very thought-provoking clarification, and I think you know, good preview, I think, to maybe the points that you might be making.
Yeah, and I know we're trying to adhere to a schedule here, so I'll be quick. I meant to be provocative, but certainly not polemical. I'm not. I guess it was really just to signal my concern with the degree to which medicine in this country is commodified, and it's not skepticism, but there's a certain amount of unsurety and caution with which I regard strategies that would see the realm of medicine as being able to advance significantly Black health as in general. Because medicine has been so preoccupied with the income level of it. And this is the AMA, for its entire history. Now that, I will admit, reflects a bit of my intellectual biases towards the pursuit of public health, which is more, the old phrase that if in medicine you're interested in the cow, in public health you're interested in the entire herd. There, with its, over the last 30 years, its research agendas of thinking about life course. How does disease happen over the life course? How do we think about weathering, and how that affects Black bodies, and how that, and how those Black bodies are affected by their environment, be it the kind of real and literal in terms of like environmental justice, but also the social and psychic environments that, contribute to allostatic load and that kind of that just daily pernicious stress that comes day after day. These are questions which I see emanating most forcefully from public health. It was just to say nothing against my friends and colleagues who work in medicine. Some of my best friends are doctors, so as any defensive person would say about any bias that they hold. But I do worry about, my question came from our often too ready conflation of health with health care, and not necessarily with health with like the larger social environment as well. Great. Provocative, so but not polemical is where I was going with that.
I think that's my cue to take over the Q&A from the audience. We already have about 5 questions in 13 minutes, so this will be fun. I might direct it to specific people, but if you have more questions, feel free to add them. So the first one is, we've got a question about the legal and opportunities to address structural inequities in healthcare, and just to make it slightly more tangible, let's say we're in an election cycle. The next president calls you up and says, what should I do on day 1? And what should I do by the time I'm done my term, thinking about what's politically feasible, to have succeeded in making a dent here? What do you tell them? Let's start with Michelle Goodwin. What do you tell the president to do on day 1, and what do you think their goal should be for their next administration?
The goal should be making sure that our agencies are populated with people who are qualified and who are capable and who will respect our Constitution, be informed by science, and carry on with a mindfulness towards not just medicine, but also public health. You think about the FDA, HHS, and so forth. We need these spaces, and even in other departments, EPA, Department of Education, there's so many spaces in which health is either a direct concern of our agencies or an indirect concern of our agencies, and our agencies are often overlooked. We've been in a space where we've been talking about the courts quite a bit, and we need to do more of that. Be mindful about that in this space too, not the Supreme Court, but the district courts and also the circuit level courts as well. So I would, from a sort of meta level, encourage that there are very well qualified people who are mindful of our Constitution, place that as a priority, the promotion of civil liberties and the protection of civil rights as a base foundation, and people who will respect science and lift it up. And also, one last thing that I'll share with that too, is also a mindfulness about the appropriateness of ethics in research too, because all of these things tie together in very important ways.
Thank you very much. Another question is about implicit bias. And so the question is provider implicit bias about patients. But again, just to give a little bit more just to the mill, there is an interesting debate in critical legal theory right now about the role of implicit bias and how much it ought to be emphasized or not. And Kimani, I know you've thought a lot about patient-provider relationships, so I'm curious if you want to talk a little about this one.
Can you say just a little, am I muted?
Yeah.
Okay.
The question was, how do we train providers to change their attitudes towards Black patients? And I'm curious also more generally about the roles of implicit bias here and how much that is, as a political movement, how much that is an important note to sound versus one that is perilous in terms of the movement's desires.
Sure. So, I mean, I think part of it needs to start with, at the beginning, with legal education. We need more Black and brown people in medical school, both as instructors and as students. I think we acknowledge that, yes, implicit bias exists, but explicit bias exists too. We can't let people off the hook that easily. We need to talk I think in medical education, needs to be able to talk more openly and honestly about bias starting at the beginning. Yeah.
Perfect. Dana, did you want to say something on that? I thought you were raising your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know I'm not supposed to raise my hand. You told me that function was disabled.
I told that to the audience, but you're allowed to. I like your hand. Go ahead.
It's my real hand now. So I wonder if I could append to both Michelle and Kamani's excellent answers. On day one, the president should reverse every health-harming executive order that this current administration has enacted. And there are a lot of them, right? We need to collect and report data. There are enormous numbers. The stroke of the pen needs to go backwards on day one immediately. And over the administration, the second thing that I think also must happen is to find a way to redefine healthcare that is reimbursable, both publicly and privately. We need to reimburse housing as healthcare, food as healthcare. We need to reimburse interventions that are social as healthcare and not just medicine and medical care itself. That's one answer. I want to say, in addition to, I agree completely with what Kamani has said also. But I want to say with respect to implicit bias, we should be very careful to recognize that implicit bias training data tells us that implicit bias training does not work. It does not work on the individual level. So I'm not saying we should stop it. I'm saying that we must wrap it into institutional changes because what we know from the data is that we don't change people's behavior by putting them in a 2-day conference, called to the trainer and checking off the box that we did implicit bias training. I feel like I need to call out the data, which is really becoming overwhelmingly clear, that institutions must be restructured to accommodate the fact that bias is inevitable, and we must train people to override their implicit biases. But if we just do implicit bias training, we're fooling ourselves.
And before you answer, let me just throw another question at you. You can answer both or you can ask one, but I want to make sure we're getting respectful to the audience,
I'll take just
right?
one, yeah.
Well, you can choose which one you want. Someone else can take the other one. There's a question about the emphasis on race is biological rather than a social construct. And of course, there was a recent critique, Dorothy Roberts, among others, has done this for a long time, but even in a journal like Science, for example, we're seeing still a lot of biological race being really treated as explanatory or important in COVID analysis, and a lot of pushback on that. So either on this line or on this new line of questioning, I'm curious.
Believe it or not, I think I might be able to line up two birds with my one stone here, and to say that both the biologization of race and its reinscription through geneticization and all these other things that Dorothy outlines, so capably, as you mentioned recently in the scope of her career. Also, I tend to regard in the same light as I do implicit bias, which both are ways of really skirting around the structural inequities that we're looking at. What I know about implicit bias is really mainly through my engagement with criminal justice reform. But I also, as Dana mentioned out, I'm also very aware that even the progenitors of the original term of implicit bias have, years ago came forward and said, it's being used in ways that we did not intend at all. And I worry that this issue or this address of implicit bias is a way to basically call out bad apples, or in this case, not even bad apples, just bad behavior. And as Dana said, check off some boxes, and we leave the structures themselves intact. Like the classic example for me was in Philadelphia with the Starbucks manager who had those 2 black men arrested just for being customers. They closed every branch down for implicit bias training the next day or like the next week. That wasn't implicit bias. Implicit bias is spur of the moment, split second decisions. She had for like 10, 15 minutes, customers yelling at her, the assistant manager saying, "You are being racist." That's not implicit bias when you continue to do something, even though you're being made aware of it. And so I think we have to be very careful about how we expand this definition of implicit bias to cover all these other things when we should be thinking about the structural. To biologize race and lean on that when we should be thinking about what is, you know, as Kamani said, and as we've all been saying, what makes Black people and our Latinx populations more vulnerable has nothing to do with biology. It's about the structure of the economy. It's about, you know, it's about segregation. It's about all these other latter day Jim Crowisms that we're still dealing with.
And I'd like to tie in just really—
Before you do, one thing, Michelle, is say, after you answer the final question, I'm just going to tip you off. It's not like law school where I get you off guard. I'm going to ask you, what is the tweet length thing you want people to take away from this panel? Because we'll have people retweet it if you tell us what it is. So that's just to set it up. But Michelle, go ahead.
Sounds great. Well, a few things here, and this builds off of what Dana was mentioning, right? There are answers that we already have in front of us, right? We have an Affordable Care Act that needs to be defended and should be even stronger. The repeal of the Helms Amendment, the repeal of the Hyde Amendment, that's not something that a president can do, but a president certainly can support that. This president has gutted Title X, which was a law that was shepherded through Congress by George H.W. Bush, signed into law by Richard Nixon, right? Completely gutted, that relates to population reproductive health care. So there are a number of things, and sort of thinking about what we already have that we can lift up and do better, and things that we can turn the boat around in order to help people who are most vulnerable, who happen to be poorer Americans.
And if I could just
go ahead, Kamani. Yep.
Tie in all your questions. I think explicit biases can create implicit assumptions, which can find their way into medical education and then feed into the biologization of race. So, for example, a study that came out very recently found that something like 40% or 30% of medical students thought that Black people were less likely to feel pain and had thicker skin. And these are like first-year medical students, and they believe this is gospel. So again, explicit racism becomes implicit assumptions, which finds its way into medical education, which biologizes race and makes it less social and more biological. And these are all the things we need to fight against.
Wonderful. So we are now at the end of our time together. I've asked you all to think about a tweet length version of what you might want people to say, right? So, or to say about this panel, or to get from this panel. We won't hold you, we won't count the characters, but something like tweetable, if you will. And Samuel, I think I'll start with you. What would you like people to take away from this panel or this topic that is pithy and succinct?
I feel like I get asked first for all the questions that I have no ready answer.
Come back to you then, one sec.
No, it's fine, it's fine. Actually,
go ahead.
You know, I would say for our readers, or our viewers rather, a hashtag that's been out there for a while, and it's a really rich thread, either SDOH for structural determinants of health, or just, I think some people have been spelling it out long, but for character, you know, you only get 280 characters, I think. For character economy, I think if you look for SDOH, there's a really interesting, like months and almost probably a couple years discussion about that on Twitter. So I'm gonna stick with the old. You don't need something new from me. I'll go with something old.
That sounds good.
Dana, I really
I'm
enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Dana, I'm going to go to you next, and I'll also mention you've got a great book on that deals with implicit bias too. But on this question about what the tweet length takeaway from this ought to be, go ahead.
Mine's going to be too long, but this is what I want to say. Health is a byproduct of justice, and injustice is very bad for your health.
Love it. Pithy reversal. You should be in marketing. No wonder you're the dean. Kamani, you go next.
Oh, I just want to say I stole that from Norman Daniels. That wasn't me.
Good writers steal and great writers steal a lot. Go ahead, Kamani.
Hard to follow that. I mean, I think that's exactly right. The next step for public health and healthcare is acknowledging structural racism and how it creates and perpetuates inequality. Too long for a tweet, but if someone could distill that.
Michelle?
And I would say vote like your health depends on it.
That's a great one.
Amen.
Especially at this political moment. Craig, we're just about out of time, but if you have a tweet that you want to share, you're welcome to, as well as my co-moderator.
I'm not going to be able to build on Michelle's. Vote because your health does depend on it.
Exactly. And get a flu shot. That's the other thing I'll tell people. Well, thank you all very much for the time today. Get registered to vote, get a flu shot, read the blog Symposium, tweet and retweet what these people have said, read their books, read their articles, because they are amazing. Thank you very much for joining us, and sorry to people in the Q&A we didn't get to.